Many believe that Henry Ford invented the automobile. He didn't, but it's a popular misconception. It's a tribute to the man who made owning a car possible for millions. A vast organization sprang from his desire to make automobiles for the great multitude. But one car stands above the rest. The car that made it all possible, the Model T. Thousands of people made a pilgrimage to Dearborn, Michigan in June of 2003 to celebrate the 100th birthday of the Ford Motor Company. It was a remarkable 5-day event that demonstrated the impact Ford has had on the world. The fans had a chance to see the world's largest display of current and historic cars that have made it so famous. Company chairman William Ford, the great-grandson of Henry Ford, and his cousin Edsel were there for the celebration. It was a reminder that this is still a company that's connected to its namesake. A caravan of Model Ts arrived from around the country to kick off the affair. Some of these cars were nearly 100 years old and were still running strong, like the company that a restless young man, Henry Ford, started in 1903. Ford was born in 1863 on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan, during a time of turmoil, the American Civil War. While the war tore the country apart, he would turn his love of machines and steam engines into something that would bring it together. His father hoped his son would become a farmer, but Henry hated the drudgery of farm work. When he was 12, his father took him on a buggy trip to Detroit. They passed a steam-powered locomotive. Henry began to dream of building a lighter, smaller version of this contraption to relieve the farmer's burden and help break the isolation of farm life. He studied engineering in his free time, and after high school, became an engineer at the Detroit Edison Lighting Company. He rented a garage on Bagley Avenue in Detroit and started work on making his dream a reality. He switched from steam to gasoline power and began to tinker with internal combustion engines. Ford wasn't the first person to think of a gasoline-powered buggy. A few years earlier, Daimler and Benz had introduced working models in Germany, as had Panhard in France. While other pioneers targeted the wealthy, Henry wanted an automobile that was cheaper, faster, and better. In June of 1896, Ford finally opened the doors of his garage and outrolled his first attempt at an automobile, the quadricycle. Its four-cylinder engine sat on a small buggy body. This motorized buggy rolled on heavy wire wheels that looked like they belonged on a bicycle. While Henry worked to improve his invention with a radiator, a better carburetor, and increased power, the new Detroit Automobile Company hired him to design experimental cars. Unfortunately, the company failed. Henry decided to focus his time and energy on a race car. He thought a few wins would make a name for him and attract backers to fund his dream car. In 1901, Ford built the Sweepstakes, an ash-framed wheeled sled powered by a massive 8.8-liter two-cylinder engine. The car wasn't very fast, and its handling was scary. The steering had to be manually unwound after each turn because the technology for self-centering wheels hadn't been invented. Ford and the Sweepstakes won their first race in October 1901. He beat the leading manufacturer and reigning national champion driver of the day, Alexander Winton. The victory generated headlines all over the country. Ford's next racer, the mighty 999, brought Henry even more publicity.
On October 25th, 1902, Barney Oldfield set a world's record in the 999. He drove it a mile a minute, and this phrase ushered in a new era.
In 1903, Ford, the racing star, was finally able to line up backers to launch his car company. Capitalizing on his fame, they called it the Ford Motor Company. Within months, the Ford Motor Company on Mack Avenue in Detroit was producing the Model A, a low-priced car with an 8-horsepower engine. Orders came in faster than they could be filled. After the Model A in 1903, Henry skipped a few letters and made it all the way to Models R and S by 1906. He outgrew his original factory and moved to a much larger building at Piquette and Beaubien Streets in Detroit. His cars were selling, but Ford wasn't completely happy with them. Most were still rich man's toys. He said he wanted to build a car for the great multitude of the finest materials available by the best workmen that can be hired, so that every man with a decent income can take a ride in the countryside and enjoy God's great pleasures. While Henry was convinced a car for the common man was what was needed, his investors disagreed. Tired of bickering, he bought up all their shares in the company. He finally had full control to do whatever he wanted. He overhauled his factory on Piquette Avenue to produce a new car, the Model T. He assembled a small team of draftsmen who worked night and day in a 12 by 15-foot room at the back of the factory. The very secretive Ford installed a drafting table so his ideas could be drawn up and hidden from the prying eyes of competitors. For good luck, he brought in his mother's rocking chair. He spent many long nights in it thinking about his new car. Finally, his dream, the Model T, chugged out and into history on October 1st, 1908. Ford called it the Universal Car. Millions of people affectionately called it the Tin Lizzie. Many say Lizzie was named after a lizard, looking like a fast little reptile. The Model T was also called a flivver, a name inspired from what the bouncy car did for the liver. Lizzie had a 4-cylinder, 20-horsepower engine, stood 7 feet high, and weighed only 1,200 pounds. The chassis, strong and lightweight, was made out of vanadium steel. The Model T was by no means a race car. 40 miles an hour was about all it could muster, just right for the unpaved roads of the day. It was a hit. Over 10,000 Model Ts were sold in the first year, an industry record. These initial buyers could have their Tin Lizzie in black, red, green, French grey or pearl. The initial price tag of the Model T was $850, a steal considering the average car buyer could expect to spend about $2,000. One of the Model T's early brochures claimed, "The Ford is a better car not because it's cheap, but because it's worth more." Ford had to ramp up production to keep pace with sales. He experimented with different ideas, separating assembly into simple, repeatable tasks, timing how long each step would take. He needed to be efficient. Over 18,000 Model Ts a year were flying out of the factory, and orders kept coming in. Others noticed his success. Billy Durant, the founder of General Motors, wanted to buy Ford Motor, but couldn't convince the banks that it was worth the $18 million asking price. Ford remained independent and beat back a patent infringement lawsuit that others feared to fight. George Selden and his syndicate had cowed most automakers into paying them royalties for every car they produced. Ford refused, and when a federal judge agreed, the Selden patent was broken. The automobile business could now flourish. Ford felt the best part about the entire lawsuit was the publicity for his Model T. The free publicity was just what he needed. Throughout the entire legal proceedings, orders continued to pour in. In 1908, to keep up with demand, Ford asked famed architect Albert Kahn to design a massive new factory in Highland Park. The Highland Park plant was the biggest job Kahn had ever attempted. He didn't believe something of that magnitude could function efficiently, but he gave it a try. When the plant opened on New Year's Day, 1910, it was dubbed the Crystal Palace. The 860-foot structure had windows running its entire length. It was efficient and modern, but within just a few years, it too would become cramped. By 1913, Henry Ford broke the 200,000 mark in Model T production. The first moving assembly line made this possible. Conveyor belts transported small parts to the worker. They'd perform a specific task, and the piece would move on to the next workstation. Ford developed this innovative system after hearing about a Chicago meat packer. There, slabs of meat on hooks moved down the line and were basically disassembled. Ford thought, if they can disassemble a cow, why not reverse the process and assemble cars? By August of 1913, the chassis assembly line was moving. Ford workers were able to complete a car in 93 minutes, an astonishing speed considering most automakers were still measuring their production time in days. In 1914, Henry Ford uttered those famous words, "The public can have any color so long as it's black." The explanation? The black enamel was the only finish that dried quickly enough for assembly line production. Henry Ford was reluctant to make any changes in his dream car. He thought it was absolutely perfect, except for a little modification here or there. One of the most astonishing changes was the drop in price. By 1914, it cost only $490, nearly half the original price. Prices fell as costs plummeted due to the efficiency of the assembly line and the use of standardized parts. Ford was now building nearly 300,000 Model Ts every year. The Model T was a phenomenon. more than 500,000 Americans owned a Tin Lizzie. The only paved street in most towns was usually Main Street, often a one-lane brick road. But after Ford built the first stretch of concrete highway, things began to change. As Ford had hoped, the Model T brought people off the farm and into the city. It even took people out of the city and into the country. As roads improved, people started to take car trips, vacations. The Model T was being used for pleasure driving. Model T production exceeded even Ford's wildest dreams, and he began work on a dream house. Henry and his wife Clara decided to build $1 million estate, Fair Lane, on a parcel of land in Dearborn. While Henry and Clara were living the good life, Ford's 15,000 workers were becoming disenchanted. Assembly line production was boring and tedious. He needed to stem absenteeism and keep his production lines humming. On January 5, 1914, Ford implemented the $5 day, double the existing minimum rate. He also cut the workday from 10 hours to 8. The announcement sparked a riot as thousands showed up to claim one of the high-paying jobs. The pay raise shocked the editors of the New York Times. They asked Ford if he was a socialist. The Wall Street Journal was aghast. Ford shrugged his shoulders. He found that better-paid workers could also buy his cars. If you cut wages, you just cut the number of your customers, he said. To some, Ford was a revolutionary. The Model T started a rural revolution. His $5 a day started a social revolution. And the moving assembly line, an industrial revolution. But this revolutionary wanted to make sure the employees who were paid $5 a day deserved it. He set up a sociological department to make sure they were able to cope with their earnings and that their home life fit in with what Ford deemed proper. Investigators would tell people how to keep house and how to handle personal situations. At first, employees thought this program was beneficial, but soon realized it was an intrusion. While people were in love with the Model T, some were starting to lose respect for Henry Ford. They didn't like how involved he became in his employees' lives, and some were upset with the virulent anti-Semitic articles published in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. Ford eventually apologized for these remarks, but by then, the damage was done. One person who probably was offended by the paper's anti-Semitism was Albert Kahn. But the Jewish architect was not about to criticize Ford, one of his best and oldest clients, especially when things were starting to roll with a new factory along Detroit's Rouge River. Ford wanted the new factory near his Fairlane estate. He envisioned single-story buildings to house all car production. A factory that unloaded raw iron ore at its docks at one end and turned out cars at the other. An industrial breakthrough. During World War I, Ford's factories made eagle boats or submarine chasers and other armaments for the war effort. Ford also supplied vehicles for the ambulance corps of the American Field Service and American Red Cross, driven by volunteers like Ernest Hemingway. This go-anywhere vehicle proved it was ready to serve. The Model T was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. By this time, Henry Ford was not only rich, he was a mega celebrity people listened to. His friends Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone joined him on a radio show.
I think so. Yes, indeed. If a young man makes up his mind to work, there's no limit to what he can do. But if he makes up his mind to go at it without the idea of work, he hasn't much chance. He must study and work, and he must go back in any art as far as he can, just dig up the very beginning. And he must, the more he goes back, the further he will be able to see ahead.
His circle included celebrities, inventors, and politicians. He set up camping trips with a few of his special friends known as the Vagabonds. The group roughed it in the wilderness with cars, stoves, refrigerators, and teams of servants. The Vagabonds included Thomas Edison, President Warren G. Harding, Harvey Firestone, and naturalist John Burroughs. Toward the end of the decade, Ford started making a few more changes to his Model T, such as lowering the body and frame for a more sleek appearance. Overall, it was basically the same car. Ford might have been too involved with other ventures to notice that the Model T was growing old. In 1924, he was 61. It was 16. On June 15th, the 10 millionth Lizzie left the factory and was snapped up at the lowest price ever, $290. Other automakers were now making comparable cars, but the Model T was still selling 6-to-1 over other marques. However, it would soon begin to lose ground. Chevrolets cost $150 more, but appealed to younger people who wanted to be modern. A used Buick was about the same price and had more features, comfort, and status. Finally, Ford had to concede that the race was over for the Model T. On May 27, 1927, the last one rolled off the assembly line. The Model T was missed by people around the world. The widow of novelist St. Clair Lewis later wrote that her husband was prouder of his Model T than his Nobel Peace Prize. Millions of cars have come out of the Ford factories since the Model T was introduced. Classics like the Mustang and the Thunderbird, and a few flops like the Edsel. Ford became the largest producer of trucks and the second largest producer of cars and trucks combined. It sells more than 80 different vehicles worldwide, including the fabled marques Aston Martin, Jaguar, Land Rover, and Volvo. But no matter what Ford goes on to produce, it's unlikely that it will ever create a car that was more important than the Model T. It literally put the world on wheels, uniting people from all walks of life. It secured the automobile's future.